All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Aaron Robertson, the author of The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise in the Promised Land in America. It was one of the New York Times 100 notable books for 2024, one of the Washington Post 50 best nonfiction books for 2024, and the New Republic writes of The Black Utopians, a captivating exploration of Black utopian movements in the United States. Robertson weaves together memoir, history, and social analysis, tracing the efforts of African Americans to create self-sufficient communities and escape systemic oppression. How are you doing today, Aaron?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Dr. Neal. It's great to be here.
Talk a little bit about your road to this book.
Yeah, it was a long one in a sense. There's a personal part of my interest in, Black utopian thought and history. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was born in this small town called Promised Land, Tennessee.
An hour away from Nashville lies the remnants of a community settled by African Americans shortly after the Civil War.
From the photos to the artifacts, they're all stories of a community called Promised Land.
They had their stores, they had churches, and of course they had this school, the Promised Land School, which was the hub of the community.
It was this all-Black freedom colony west of Nashville that was established a few years after the Civil War ended. And, this was the kind of community that I grew up, going to as a kid, often for family reunions. And, it was my time to leave Detroit, where I was born and from, to really experience kind of a sense of community and family. But it was only later in life, really, that I began to, I think, appreciate the, historical weight and importance of a place like Promised Land. It was one of many examples of these all-Black towns that existed throughout North America, in Canada and also the U.S. And so I was compelled by that history, and also I think I had really been interested in the countercultural, shifts and changes of the 1960s and 70s. I've kind of been interested in alternative, social movements. And I know that in a place like Detroit, I think those kinds of stories tended to not really get, I think, a lot of focus in national media. A lot of the focus on Detroit was about how it was the city that was always experiencing decline, and it was defined by the kind of despair of its people, and that was a harmful narrative that I wanted to sort of push against. So the book is really bridging, I think, these 19th century Black utopian spaces with a 20th century story about black counterculture in general.
Yeah, one of the things that you narrate in the book is that, growing up in Detroit, as you just mentioned, there was not a lot of attention to the different ways that Detroit was a meaningful contributor to what we understand as the civil rights movement. I mean, everybody knows about Motown, for instance. You think about Martin Luther King giving the great March for Freedom speech in June of '63, essentially previewing the March on Washington speech that he gives in August. Berry Gordy, again, talking about Detroit, had the wherewithal to record that speech, right? Yes. Even before the March on Washington speech. You think about a figure like Reverend C.L. Franklin, right, who's an important in terms of Black Christian thought in the Black church. Obviously, his daughter plays this out, but you also find this figure, Albert Cleage.
I want to go for a moment to Reverend Cleage's congregation in Detroit and ask Reverend Cleage if I can still get him. Nobody, I think, Dr. Cleage, would deny that there is a struggle in this country Can you still hear me?
All right, let's go.
Okay.
We are through with this white hypocrisy, with the efforts of white people to set up a situation that they can control. We are tired of sociologists and psychologists talking us to death. We are tired of police commissioners and police experts telling us that we're not getting our heads whipped. We are through. The black revolution is in progress, and it's going on, and we don't care what kind of gun they
Dr. Poussin.
Who becomes this critical figure, this black nationalist Christian figure that's coming out of the city of Detroit. Talk a little bit about Cleage and his mission and who he was.
Yeah, so, a big part of the book is about this a fascinating institution called the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And it's best, it was established in the early 1950s, actually, by a minister named Cleage Jr. And, Cleage is a fascinating character because I think now he is best known as this really firebrand, black nationalist minister who was really the face of Detroit's, black nationalist movement in the late 1960s.
Black people are not worried about white people in the suburbs. What we're trying to do is to control our own community, build our own black community, and make it beautiful. Self-determination as a concept for black people is a part of the rebellion. It's a black revolution in sweeping America, and self-determination is the expression. That's what we want. That's what we're rebelling for.
Especially after the rebellion in Detroit in the summer of 1967. But his origins are fascinating because Cleage was born to a man who became the first, black doctor to be hired by the city of Detroit. Cleage grew up essentially in upwardly mobile Black Detroit, family. He and his family were often in the kind of Black socialite, papers, and they were really a part of this high society. But Cleage was also really drawn to social work for a time. Like before he became a minister, he had briefly worked as a social worker. And I think that experience exposed him to the really stark, contradictions of life in Detroit. He came from a well-to-do background, but he was seeing the plight of Black people on the east side of Detroit who were living in really inhospitable conditions. And so there was a world in which Cleage could have ignored this fact and these realities, and kept himself apart from it. But I think as a thinker, he would recognize really that there was not that much of a difference really between someone like him and people on the east side. Cleage himself was the grandson of a man who had been enslaved, right? So there was not this grand distance between Black social classes, and it was that awareness that would go on to shape his entire ministry. Like in the 1950s, there was a time when Cleage believed in the value of integration as a social goal. Like he was not always this, this outspoken Black nationalist, but in the early 1960s, he really began to sour on a lot of the kind of mainstream, civil rights groups. He didn't think that the Urban League and the NAACP were doing enough really to address reality in this country. And so, that is really the root of his later activism and work.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what his relationship might have been with some of the other more militant and radical figures of that period of time? Obviously thinking about Malcolm X individually, but also thinking more broadly on an institutional level, the Nation of Islam or the Black Panther Party. How was he able to navigate relationships with those folks and at the same time adhere to a religious practice, that many folks thought was not radical, right? It was not militant enough.
Yeah, it's the Shrine of the Black Madonna is located. I mean, it still exists and is located on a street in Detroit called Linwood Street. And I think for a time, my sort of contention is that Linwood Street was one of the most kind of radical whole like streets in the country in a way, because you had the Shrine of the Black Madonna, but just about a mile or so away, you had Temple Number 1 of the Nation of Islam, and you had C.L. Franklin's New Bethel Baptist Church, and so there was in the mid 20th century this really, I think, robust exchange between all kinds of radicals in Detroit. Now, Cleage was very much, of course, aware of the Nation of Islam, and he was a really he embraced like Malcolm X and kind of what he stood for in terms of the pursuit of Black self-determination. I think that Cleage was inspired by the fact that the Nation of Islam, owned and operated its own businesses and owned, property throughout the country, not only in Michigan, but in parts of the South as well. It's funny because Cleage and the members of his church were often mistaken for being part of the nation, because they also kind of espoused a similarly militant aesthetic, and Cleage himself was known for wearing this this like bow tie and white shirt, and so people didn't know, a lot of people, when they learned of Cleage, did not know that he was a Christian minister. And I think what set Cleage apart at this time is that, yes, he was a Black nationalist, but he was also a real believer that Christianity, and that the Christian church in particular, was one of the most sensible, I think, bases for Black radical action. That was a part of the real falling out, I think, between Cleage and a lot of people around him who said, the Christian church is has been such a contributor to like the state of Black despair in the country. How can it be a real sort of mobilizing force in Black life? Cleage was aware of these criticisms and agreed, actually, that there was a version of Christianity that was really a plantation religion that was not interested in radical social change, but was interested more in maintaining a status quo. That was not the vision of Christianity that Cleage was espousing. He was very much at the forefront of what would come to be known as Black theology or Black liberation theology, which in short, is this idea that true Christianity, is a religion that that sides with those who have been disinherited, and downtrodden. So it was a fine line that Cleage was always walking.
You mentioned in the book that Cleage really didn't think of himself as a utopian, right? He thought of himself as a realist. Can you talk a little bit about, in his vision and really the vision that you lay out through this book, the importance of building and sustaining Black institutions, right? I mean, you began with Promised Land, right, which in and of itself is a small town of Black institutions, right, run by Black people, set up for the interests of Black folks. integration changes some of the dynamics of what we think of these self-contained, self-determined Black spaces for lots of reasons.
Right.
But Cleage, through the Shrine of the Black Madonna, remains committed to this idea of building and maintaining institutions. What were some of the challenges he faced in that regard?
Yeah. I think, one of the interesting things about writing about utopian movements is that there is always this tension between really embracing and pursuing your ideals of what societal transformation actually looks like, right? Like the most sort of kind of far out ideas about how to change the world. And there is the need to balance that with the awareness that you have to also be practical in some ways to enact your dreams. And so, Clay was someone who, he scorned the label of utopian. Actually, I don't think he would. I don't think he would even agree that he was a part of a long utopian tradition necessarily. But the mantra of the movement that Cleage started, which he called Black Christian nationalism, was that nothing is more sacred than the liberation of Black people, and that idea was what guided all of the kind of experiments that his church would lead in in the arts, in politics, in education, in land ownership. Cleage was very aware that institution building was going to be important for Black communities. His version of utopianism, as I argue, was not something that he was not trying to remove himself or to encourage like Black Americans to remove themselves from American life. He was not interested in going, like back to the land, in the woods, sort of running away from conflict. His version of Black separatism was not geographical. Like it wasn't, he wasn't doing like what the New Africans were talking about, like, this dream of kind of establishing a literal, nation state within the bounds of the United States. Instead, what he said is that, white society has shown us the ways in which it does not really see us as part of, and so we need to build parallel institutions. We need to make sure that we have our own housing and, living arrangements. We need to make sure that we have our own, economic structures, our own land to ensure that like we can live, full and prosperous lives. And so it wasn't this perfect vision of a life devoid of conflict. Cleage knew that conflict was always going to be a part of Black American life. The question was, how do you live a really flourishing life while knowing that there are so many, forces around you that won't want to tear you down,
Beyond the success of institution building and challenging public policy at the time, I mean, much of the impact of the civil rights and Black power, Black radical movement of the time, has to do with the way that it deployed imagery and symbols. We think about the power of the Black Power fist, for instance. We think about the role of the Afro. Cleage understood this also.
Yes.
Talk about his relationship with the artist Glanton Dowdell in creating this mural, that really is kind of like one of the long-standing images and reminders of how important the shrine was.
Yes. When you walk into the sanctuary of the shrine in Detroit, the first thing your eye will be drawn to, is probably this beautiful 18-foot tall by 9-foot wide mural of a Black Madonna and child. the mural was painted in 1967 by a Black nationalist artist named Glanton Dowdell. Dowdell was, he grew up on the east side of Detroit, like in the very kind of poor, neighborhoods that Cleage was exposed to as a social worker. Dowdell grew up during the Depression in really abject poverty, and as a young man, he got into a lot of trouble. He actually served a decade-long prison sentence for murder, and at the same time, he was a brilliant visual artist, and it was during his years in prison when he really sort of refined his art practice. When Dowdell got out of prison in the early 1960s, there was someone that Cleage worked closely with named Edward Vaughn. Vaughn was really a central part of Detroit's Black radical scene. He had this bookstore in Detroit called Vaughn's Bookstore. It was the first Black-owned bookstore in Detroit, and it was Vaughn who took note of Glanton Dowdell's work, and as the Shrine of the Black Madonna was trying to figure out, how it wanted to be a part of the Black Power movement, a part of the conversation that they were having in the church was how to really transform the sort of imagery that was a part of the church, because there was this old mural actually of a kind of pilgrim arriving on America's eastern shores that was in the sanctuary. It was really this white utopian movement that had a very central position in the church. So there was a debate, like, should there be a mural instead of a Black Christ, maybe, and that's actually what Cleage had wanted initially. But then Vaughn read a poem in an issue of Negro Digest called Black Madonna. And he hadn't known of this really long tradition of, Black Madonna icons, but he was so moved by it that he told Cleage, maybe we should actually do a kind of a mural painting of a Black Mary. And so that's where Dowdell came in. And the mural itself was revealed just a few months before the rebellion in Detroit, and it was controversial at the time, for some obvious reasons. There were a lot of people who thought it was heretical, right? I mean, it was the kind of image that hadn't been seen so prominently, perhaps since Marcus Garvey's, mural of a Madonna and Child in the 1920s, and there were people within Cleage's own congregation who saw the mural and were stunned by it, but also thought that it was going to put Cleage's life in danger. There were people who told him, like, this is going to get you killed. But what it did actually for so many people, for the first time, it gave them a sort of visual affirmation of this idea that what they understood about the foundations of their lives, the kind of narratives that had shaped their existence, these weren't stable stories, and they could be challenged and they could be turned on their head. And so if the mother of Christ could be a Black woman, and if Christ himself could be Black, then perhaps all of the inherited stories about the way the world worked could be turned over, not only in religion, but in politics too, in the way that this country, is governed. I think the role of the arts in utopian movements really can't be overstated. Yeah.
Speaking of art, you use a painting from the great Barclay Hendricks
Yeah.
on the cover of your book. Talk a little bit about that choice.
Yeah, the cover of my book is the work Lauded Mama by the wonderful portraitist Barclay Hendricks, and this was a piece that he created in 1969, and I think a lot of people mistake the woman for being, Angela Davis,
Angela
because
Davis,
she has
yeah.
this vibrant fro and she has this really sort of, determined expression. But it was actually a cousin of Barclay Hendricks. But that image is I think a real encapsulation of what the book is about. It's this sort of merging of religious, iconography, this sort of, gold leaf background that we tend to associate with Christian saints, with a real sort of grounded experience of Black life. I think that central to Black theology is this notion that Black life and all parts of it are sacred and should be seen as such. And so, that I think to have that portrait by the great Hendricks on the cover is really, I was so happy that we were able to feature it.
This book is also about your relationship with your father, and the two of you writing letters to each other. Talk a little bit about that relationship.
Yeah. So my father was incarcerated from the time I was 8 until I was 18, and that was obviously a difficult, trying experience for him and for me as well. There was a long period when he was in prison where we would exchange letters to one another, and over time, I think for all kinds of reasons, it was hard for me to feel kind of a real sort of emotional tie and connection to my father, and I started to really drift away. And I at a certain point, I might have been either in middle school or high school, I lost the original letters that he had written for me. I don't know like where they are or what happened to them. When he got out of prison, I was, in my first year of college, and in the years after that, we, like in our own sort of tortured way, we're I think trying to build some kind of relationship. And I honestly think it was very difficult for both of us, but I knew that we were both kind of fascinated with, a little obsessed by alternative lives, like, right, like the people we could have been, under different circumstances. I think it is. I have to believe that people are capable of change, and of working through the things like that have harmed them the most. But the reality is that is very difficult to do. And so, anyways, in 2020, when I was beginning to work on this book, I knew that my father was a great writer, because he had written me a short story while he was in prison, and like not just a good writer, but a great writer. And I asked my dad if he would contribute a new series of letters to the book, about his life, about his background, the life that he had before he was incarcerated, about his time in prison, and also the aftermath, like when he got out, what was the life he was trying to build for himself. I think so many stories about utopia tend to focus mainly on the really large scale,
Right.
visions of changing our world. And that's important. And I wanted to write about that in the book as well. But what tends to maybe be ignored is that utopian desire begins as a very individual experience. It begins with people who are wondering about what their lives could have been. And there's something a little mournful and I think elegaic about that. And to be honest, my relationship with my father now is not good. It's a really challenging thing. But I wanted to write about that, and I wanted his voice to be a part of the book as well. I wanted him to be able to tell his story too.
Talk a little bit about Beulah land farms. It feels like a throwback in some ways, but in this moment of time where Black folks, are thinking about forward motions around sustainability, how we're going to eat, where we're going to live, and that's both about climate change as it is the political realities at the moment. How important was Beulah land farms?
Yeah, so Beulah, the story of Beulah land farms is really occupies the last part of the story, that I'm telling. As much as I wanted to write something about how utopia is not just about the physical spaces, it's also about the ways that people are attempting to build relationships with each other. It's also undeniable that a part of envisioning a life for yourself means that you are trying to build real spaces for yourself in the world. You're trying to find out where you can be in this world and flourish. And so a big part of Cleage's mission and of the mission of the Black Christian nationalists was to attain property in the South, where they could establish a farm that would grow produce that they could then send to cities throughout the country. Their goal was to feed Black communities that were experiencing levels of food apartheid. This was a goal and mission that had been articulated as early as the early 1970s, but Cleage and the people of his church had no idea where this land would actually be. In fact, Beulah Land Farm had its name before the church even had a property, and that I think is really indicative of the sort of importance of naming a goal, of naming this ideal before you even know exactly what shape it takes. But over the course of decades, the members of the Shrine were, fundraising constantly for all of the church's projects, and they were raising money for a farm that they hoped to buy one day, and with the help of various people, but including one man named Wesley Godfrey, who had worked in animal husbandry at Tuskegee Institute and was eventually a part of the Shrine. They learned of this old cattle ranch in South Carolina, in Abbeville County, South Carolina, that had actually been owned by a virulently racist man, who was known for breeding these purebred old Hereford cattle. But when that man died, it was an opening for the church to purchase it. And so in the mid 1990s, with all of the money that the church had raised over decades some, $10 million dollars. The church purchased thousands of acres of land in really the sort of birthplace and endpoint of the Confederacy. Like that part of South Carolina was, where a lot of scenes, played out at the beginning and end of the Civil War. So here was a Black nationalist, eventually Pan-African church that decided to, take on this land in a really contested part of the American South. And when they moved in, it was funny. Some locals in the area thought that they were, AK-47 wielding members of, Farrakhan's nation. But in fact, like over time, the shrine was able, I think, to convince more people that really like what they were doing was not about, it wasn't about that. It wasn't, they were just attempting to like carve out a space where Black people could feel safe and protected. The ironic thing about Beulah land is that even though it was intended to grow produce, because it was this old cattle ranch, it actually was not suited, for that purpose. And so even now, the church like still owns Beulah land, and but there is this conversation about what the land can be used for. Its operations were really sort of vibrant from the early 2000s until the recession, and the recession like kind of halted like most operations on Beulah land for a time. But I wanted to tell that story because it's really about this the hard-earned pursuit of property. And there are so few institutions, so few Black-led institutions that have acquired this kind of land on such a massive scale. And the fact that it's still owned by the church, but its fate is not completely clear, I think is also a part of this, a part of what I'm trying to get at when I write about utopia. It's not so much about the end point. It's really about, each step of the way.
In this political moment, everything that's going on, the attacks on DEI, what is the lesson for Black folk, particularly young Black folk, to be gained from reading the Black Utopians?
Yeah, it's something that, I have been thinking a lot about for a while, but especially in the lead up to last fall's election, and in the aftermath of it. One thing that caught my eye towards the end of the first Trump administration was when he created the 1776 Commission, which was essentially made in response to the 1619 Project and sort of other examples of attempting to reframe American history, in ways that kind of emphasize the experiences of Black Americans. Right now, because we are sort of undergoing this real all-out assault on Black history, on so many other people's history, I think the aim of utopian stories is one to ensure that these sort of mythical, dominant narratives are consistently challenged. It will be increasingly important now that that these kinds of stories about utopian, organizing spaces are shared and circulated widely. I think that, like, at its best, utopian thought is meant to encourage ways of challenging a harmful status quo. Utopian movements are always transforming and shifting. They tend not to last because they are responding to certain historical conditions. We saw even in 2020, at the same time that the pandemic was ravaging, our world, and the protests for racial justice were happening, it felt like this sort of apocalyptic moment. But at the same time, we saw the expansion of mutual aid networks. We saw conversations about, reparations, task forces really taking shape. We saw many, Black people buying land throughout the country as kind of a shelter or haven from some of the craziness around us. These were all instances in varying degrees of utopian action, of an insistence on a world that looked very different from the one like that we had. And so I think, that I want people to sort of be aware of this, to not lose sight of the very, histories that the current administration is really trying to eradicate.
You've been watching Left of Black. We've been joined today by Aaron Robertson, the author of The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America. Thank you for joining us today, Aaron.
Thanks, Dr. Neal. This was such a pleasure.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.